Hi, and welcome once again to the course Life of Christ. We're in the middle of class 7. In the first part of this class, we discussed the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes as three of the most important people groups during the time of Jesus' ministry. And now we want to continue telling the story of the Zealots and also the Herodians, Samaritans, and the pagans. First of all, with the Zealots, their name is obviously based on the zeal which they had to have the nation of Israel as a sovereign nation, and how they didn't want anyone else to tell them what to do. The name is actually based on some of the actions of Phinehas the priest in Numbers chapter 25, when he was zealously and aggressively defending the moral law of God. If you look into history, Josephus the historian tells the story of Judas of Galilee, who led a rebellion in the year 6 AD when Jesus was about 10 years old. And he was teaching the fourth philosophy. And it's called the fourth because the first, second, and third philosophies were the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes. And this fourth philosophy had to do with the sovereignty of Israel as a nation. Now, the Zealots had different places they lived in Israel. They had a stronghold in Gamla in the north. They had another stronghold in Masada in the south. And then they were also scattered throughout the nation. There were a number that lived in the caves of the cliffs of Arbel near the Sea of Galilee. In fact, some think that Simon the Zealot, who was one of Jesus' apostles, was living perhaps in those caves when Jesus came by one day and looked up and called them to follow him. Then, of course, in different cities of Israel and, of course, in Jerusalem, there was a presence of the Zealots as well. And the Zealots believed that the kingdom of God was only going to come by force. They believed it was legitimate and permissible to use force if you could achieve the goal of Israel becoming its own nation. And they were committed really to killing for this belief. Anyone that opposed them, Romans or Greeks for sure, but even Jews that did not agree with them, they weren't above killing. And in fact, a number of the Zealots would go around as assassins, and they would sneak up behind some of the enemies of the people, and they would try to kill them so they could further their cause. If we look at some of these places where they lived, first go to Galilee, near the Sea of Galilee, a little bit to the northeast of it, you see the red star marking the site of Gamla. And if you go to that site today, it's one of the national parks of Israel up in the north. You see this hill, kind of a large hill or small mountain, and it has the shape of a camel because Gamla in Hebrew means camel. And so you can see from this picture there, you see, first of all, the synagogue that's down here. We'll look at that later on in a future video in more detail. But a first century synagogue, pretty important. You see the wall that was around the city right here. We'll come to see more of that later. You see some of the houses and everything, and then, of course, the very peak. You can see how it would be a defensible place in case of attack, and that's actually one of the last two strongholds of the Zealots against the Romans in the 60s AD. If you go down the valley and across, there's a path you can take all the way across the valley. You come to the wall, the original wall from the first century, and you see the original breach in the wall made by the Romans on their second attack against the city of Gamla. And then they went on into the city and attacked and killed the inhabitants, men, women, and children. Some of them wanted to get away from the Romans and jumped over the edges of this cliff here almost, and others were thrown over the edges down into the valley below by the Romans. And so a pretty terrible scene showing how the Romans would do anything to get rid of people who rebelled against them. And then if you go all the way down to southern Israel, there's another famous place called Masada, which means fortress in Hebrew. That's the Hebrew word for Masada there beneath it. And Masada was actually on the shores of the Dead Sea during that time. And you can see it here circled. It looks kind of like an aircraft carrier almost in the middle of the desert, just cruising through the desert. And if you zoom a little bit in, you begin to see some of the remnants of the story of Masada in the 60s, probably around 68 AD in the first century. And the story is that after the Jews rebelled against the Romans came back and crushed the Jews all over the country. They went to the middle, they went to Caesarea Maritime, they went to Gamla, they went to Jerusalem, of course, and then they went down to Masada and Qumran and other places and just pretty much wiped out all opposition. They got down to Masada, and if you understand the history of this place, it was actually a fortress palace constructed by Herod the Great as one of a series of fortress palaces for his protection and his pleasure. He was paranoid that people would come and chase him, and so he set up a string of fortress palaces all over the southern part of Judah, one in Machaerus, just across the Dead Sea, on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, palace at Jericho, fortress palace at Herodion, a palace at Caesarea Maritime, and then this amazing feat of engineering construction at Masada in the desert. You can look at this picture and you can see on one end a little bit of Herod's palace there on the northern end, and then the steep walls of the fortress all the way around. And then you can see how hard it would be to get up without being wiped out. You're very vulnerable as you would come up. This snake trail here, named for the shape of it, was one of the only ways up at that time. And so the Romans gave up quickly the idea of just charging up the side of the mountain to attack. Instead, they thought they would lay back and wait to see if the food and water of the zealots would run out and they could surrender or at least be weaker when they attacked. And so you see down here below, they built encampments, and they found the walls and even some of the individual quarters inside these encampments still today. They built a siege wall about 6 feet tall all the way around Masada, and then a lot of other things to just kind of lay siege in an effective fashion. What they didn't know is that Herod had built the fortress in such a way that all the water that came from the mountains on the west would run down into deep giant cisterns in the heart of Masada. And he laid up supplies for 10,000 soldiers for 10 years in the enormous granaries that were at the top of Masada. And so the zealots weren't going to run out of food or water. And there were about almost 1,000 zealots inside the walls. And so for almost a year, the siege had no effect. In fact, the zealots would even come to the edge of the walls and put out their laundry. They'd wring out the water in front of the Romans who were sweating and thirsty down below, who had to walk all the way to Engedi for water from a spring, which is a long, hot walk both ways. And so finally they decided, well, this is not going to work. We can't just wait them out down here at the bottom. Now, if you were standing down where the Romans were, you see how imposing Masada is from below, and you see the beginnings of the trail, the snake trail, up here all the way up, okay? And so they decided that they needed to build a ramp, a siege ramp, but they didn't start on this side. This side is about 1,300 feet up to the top. And so they went around to the western side, which was a lot closer to the top, and they began to move hundreds of tons of dirt with their soldiers and also with slaves from the Jews themselves, and finally built this ramp over the process of several months. Now, you see pictures here of this trail. Didn't have the railing, obviously, back then, much more dangerous trail back then. And then you see the siege ramp from above looking down here. And this is a little bit different than it was back in the first century. It was a lot broader. Obviously, you could send, soldiers several wide up the ramp when they built it. Then if you look from the other end, down from below, you see the walls of Masada once again. And so they got the ramp finished, and all this time they had been trying to soften up the zealots up on top with their catapults. They've even found a lot of the rocks and kind of stacked them up that were left over from the siege back in the first century. They found or kind of were able to recreate a siege tower similar to the ones the Romans would have used, and this, along with the catapults, are part of the props used in a movie made about Masada several decades ago. And so you can see how they planned to take Masada, they planned to roll these siege towers loaded with soldiers up to the wall and then lift them up. You see the cranks, you can lift them up and then break through the wall and then pour in through the hole in the wall and then attack all the zealots inside. And at that point, they would have won. And you can also see here the granaries. These are part of the granaries that were just full of all kinds of grain. In fact, they found some of this grain, and the seeds are still viable to grow and to eat later on. And then you see around the top of Masada just how bleak it is. It's just dirt and rock and heat and some wind. They had different quarters for the soldiers and for people and the commandant at the top, but it's just not a hospitable place at all. Now I want to switch off of this and go over and share another 360 video that we have. And we're standing now in about the same position as the last picture was taken. We have here the watchtower that you see. And so if you start to spin around just a little bit, again, you see just how bleak it is. Now we're over kind of on a little bit toward the western side, northwestern side. See a lot of the leftover buildings that ringed the edges of it. And then just again, just a great view, really beautiful view from there. Coming all the way back around. You see the Dead Sea in the distance there toward the east. And then back to the watchtower right here. Now if we move this forward just a little bit, get a little bit of different perspective. Now we're more on the western side of Masada. We'll spin over here toward the right. You see again some of these buildings kind of in the middle, kind of to the northwest side. And now we're looking away from the sun and toward the west. And you can't quite see it, but the ramp is just over the wall on the western side. Then you see more toward the north, up toward Jerusalem there. And then again, some of the quarters and fortifications. This is the little gate right here that led down to the water cisterns. This area over here leads to Herod's palace and that area. So really impressive, but yet bleak place. And this is the place that the zealots were defending once again. Now let me get back over to our PowerPoint. Okay. So the story continues that once the Romans got the ramp built, they were ready to break through the wall the next morning. And so that night on top of Masada, the zealots got together and they were addressed by their leader Eleazar. And he gave an impassioned speech about how the Romans were terrible oppressors and terrible enemies, and if they allowed the Romans to defeat them and to capture them, that the women would be raped and the children would be enslaved and they would all be tortured, and then finally they would all die. And so he convinced the people that night that it would be better for the zealots if they committed suicide to take away all of those benefits for the Romans the next day. And so he did it. He convinced everyone to commit suicide. And so in this room right here that you're seeing, it's the place where they found 10 lots, where they selected 10 of the men to be the executioners, basically. And so they killed all the families and all the rest of the people, and then one of the men killed the other 9, and then he killed himself. And so the next morning, when the Romans came in, they expected a battle and everything, and they saw all the food and the water and the arms all piled up just to show the Romans that they hadn't run out of any of those, but that they had chosen to take their own lives rather than submit to the Romans. And so just a tragic end for this group, such a wasteful end in many ways. And that sacrifice and that zeal, that desperation has become an inspiration for the Israelis now. And one of their phrases is never again. Never again will the nation of Israel be subject to any other nation. And for a long time, the officers in the army would come to Masada and be commissioned, and they would say, never again. So that's the story of Masada and the zealots. And with it, the zealots were wiped out, of course, by the Romans. You may ask how we know this story, if everybody was killed or if they committed suicide. And actually, it seems that at least 2 or 3 people kind of snuck away and hid before the suicides or the killings began. And that's how we got the story. One person even thinks that Josephus might have been up there as well and one of the ones that hid. But anyway, that's the story that's come down to us. So, Zealots, quite a long, interesting story. The Herodians is much shorter. As you would guess from the name, they were the group that followed Herod the Great and his power that he had. This group was all about power with the Romans. Herod was given his kingship over Judea by the Romans. It was all about currying favor with the leaders, about giving and receiving gifts. Herod built many things that he did in honor of the Caesars and named in their honor as well. And they were not at all religious. It was all about position and power. And as we discussed, the Sadducees, they collaborated a lot with the Herodians and the Romans for that same reason, the power that it gave many of them. So this is another important group, short-lived in some ways during the time of Jesus. And then you have the Samaritans, and if you read it all, the stories in the Old and New Testament, you know a bunch of the history already. But the beginnings of the group really are traced back to the defeat of the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 BC by the Assyrians. If you recall, there was the divided kingdom of Israel to the north and Judah to the south, and how the northern kingdom had terrible kings. All the kings were evil, and finally the Lord sends the Assyrians to wipe out that nation and then take them off to be captives. Before that time, there were no Samaritans. I mean, there was a capital city of Samaria, but there were no Samaritans as such. It was just the northern kingdom of Israel. After that time, when the Assyrians left, they left behind the oldest, the weakest, the sickest ones that really weren't worth taking north as captive and slaves. And so those people gradually, began to intermarry with some of the other people that were there. The Assyrians brought in people from other nations as well to mingle and mix and intermarry with the leftovers there from the people. And so gradually this new group, the Samaritans, were formed, and they were despised really by the pure-blooded Jews that thought they had sacrificed their values and their morals by intermarrying with other nations. So the Samaritans began there. That's one of the possible connections to their name. Another one is the actual verb shamar in Hebrew, which you can see samarim, the ones of the shamar, the ones who keep the Torah, who keep the law, who are obedient. That's the meaning of shamar in Hebrew. And so in their eyes, they were still in the land, and they still kept the Torah, still kept the law. And so they were the Samarim. And so that's another possibility. And then if you recall, as the Jews from Judah went off to Babylon and then gradually came back from that exile and began to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple and the walls, at least on 2 occasions, the Samaritans come a little bit from the north, and they come down to Jerusalem, and they offer help. And we don't know if they offered it sincerely and really wanted to get back and be united with the people again, or if they had some ulterior motives. But whatever their motives were, the Jews weren't having any of it. And they rejected the help both times. They said, "You're not pure Jews anymore. We don't need your help. This is our temple, and this is our work." And so obviously you can see how a lot of the bitterness and resentment and enmity traced to those events as well. And one of the guys that was there when Nehemiah was rebuilding the walls and rejected was Sanballat. He offered help and was rejected, and that also led to other events as well. Now, if you look at a map, you see that there's Samaria here, about where the town was, and it's actually called Sebast today, but it's the capital city there. It's right at where the capital, the kingdom was for people like Ahab and Omri. And then you see the area around it. It's the central Israel right here. And then in that area, the Samaritans, after they were rejected, decided they would maintain their own sanctuary on Mount Gerizim. And this is the one built by Sanballat. and he was the father of a young lady who eventually married a priest named Manasseh, no connection to the king. And that priest was thrown out of Jerusalem for marrying a Samaritan woman. But part of the deal was that Sanballat would let Manasseh be the high priest of this new temple they were building in Mount Gerizim if he would come and serve. And so that's what they did. The temple was built. Manasseh served as the priest and was, of course, the husband of Sanballat's daughter. And so you wonder if this temple, which was supposed to be a replica of the temple in Jerusalem, you wonder if this is the one that the Samaritan woman mentions in John chapter 4. Now, to give you a little bit of visual background, you've seen a little bit like this before. You have Mount Ebal on the right, the mountain of curses, Mount Gerizim, the mountain of blessings on the left, and then in the valley between them, the city of Shechem, or Nablus today, and you've already seen the little village of Sychar on the outskirts of Shechem. And if you go a little bit closer to Mount Gerizim, there's at least two different churches there. We mentioned before in a previous class the temple, and then this one is excavations of the Byzantine church, probably the 3rd or 4th century AD, that was built on Mount Gerizim as well. So you see there more the view from almost the peak down into the valley in the city of Shechem. Now, the Samaritans today still hold to 5 pillars of faith. And just briefly, they're the following. One is a belief in God as the true God, and of course, we are in agreement on that. The second one is a belief in Moses as the supreme apostle of God. And if you take this one along with number 3, the acceptance of the Torah, the Pentateuch, as the only authentic law of God, then it makes sense that Moses would be the supreme apostle. Because if you don't accept the rest of the Old Testament, or what it says about a Messiah, if you don't accept Jesus and the New Testament, then Moses is your guy. He was the key figure in the Pentateuch and the leader of the people during that time. And so you can see how those two beliefs would work together. The fourth belief was the one that Mount Gerizim is a place chosen by God to be worshipped. And then the fifth one is an expectation of a final day of rewards and punishments. And of course, we agree with that one as well. And so you take these Samaritans that began after the exile into Assyrian captivity and the history that they have, and they have held fast to the Pentateuch as their law, and they've celebrated events such as the Passover for almost 2,700 years. And if you go, as I understand it, if you go during the Passover time and celebrate it, it'll be just like the Jews have been celebrating it for millennia. Now, there's some pictures that have been taken on the eve of one of the Passovers there, and this picture probably shows a good part of the population of the remaining Samaritans in the world today, probably 600 to 700 people, because they only marry among themselves. This is the high priest and his son coming out and getting ready for the Passover. You see another priest, just a typical priest there in a different color robes. And then one of the elders of the people as well, waiting for the Passover to come. And then you have, let me go back here, you have people who are waiting for this. And notice their hats, different kinds of hats, kind of interesting selection there. And then men who bring up the lamb and are getting ready to sacrifice the lamb. And then you see actually the sacrifice and cooking the lamb and getting ready for the Passover meal. And as part of the celebration of that, one of the things that you see here is how there's blood on their forehead. And again, it may be connected to how, for example, the laws were written on their forehead, or the phylacteries there were on their forehead, tied to their forehead. And so this blood, again, is close to the mind. The sacrifice is always close to the mind of the Jews. And then just one more that reminds you of Passover is blood on the portals of this house. Obviously, this one's made out of stone and metal, but you see the blood smeared there on the pillars to the sides of the gate, reminding us of Exodus in the very first Passover. So again, interesting story of people who have been hanging on fiercely to their beliefs and practices for 2,700 years. Just an amazing story. And if you ever can, it'd be neat to go over there and visit, especially during Passover, if that's possible. Then we have the group of pagans or Gentiles during the time of Jesus. Especially, there was a group in the Decapolis. If you remember, the Decapolis is actually a collection, an area of about 10 different cities. And we'll flip to this next slide real quickly and then come back. You see that a lot of the cities here in red are cities that are part of the 10 cities of the Decapolis. Deca for 10 and polis for cities, as well as other cities that Jesus went to, like Caesarea Philippi and Capernaum and others. But the red cities are the Decapolis cities, and you see how only one is west of the Jordan, Scythopolis, and all the rest are over to the east of the Jordan in an area that's considered to be largely pagan or Gentile. Now, people wondered about the name of this place. They wondered who the inhabitants of this place were. And one explanation possibly is that the tribes or the nations, all the ites in Joshua, all that are mentioned, especially in Joshua 3:10, perhaps when they were defeated and thrown out of Canaan by the Israelites during the conquest, that they all went east of the Jordan and had to settle down over there. For the Jews, these people that lived in the Decapolis had many disgusting customs that they didn't want anything to do with it. They worshipped idols and a number of different idols. They raised pigs, and not only raised them, but they ate them when they got done raising them. They permitted nudity in mixed public baths and in the schools, perhaps in the theater, and much more. So any self-respecting Jew wouldn't want anything to do with the Decapolis or the pagans over there. And there were also others who were Gentiles back at that time, but some of them were maybe proselytes or God-fearers, like Acts 17 mentions, for example. And so it's interesting to compare the attitudes of the Jews, of Jesus, and of Paul toward this group of Gentiles or pagans. Obviously, the Jews, we've already described how they felt, rejection and loathing. Jesus, though, in his ministry, he ministers to the Jews on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Then he gets in the boat and he goes all the way across and lands in the Decapolis where all the pagans are. And the first thing that greets him is a man who's crazy, who has legion of demons inside of him. And you would think, what is a good rabbi doing over in the Decapolis in a pagan country near demons, near actually a herd of pigs? What's a good Jew doing there? And you see that Jesus was primarily concerned with giving his love and acceptance also on that side of the Sea of Galilee, of pagans who needed him just as much. And then you see the attitude of Paul, who believes then later who's instrumental in being the apostle to the Gentiles and showing the Jews and other people that God loves the Gentiles too, and the Gentiles don't have to become Jews in order to be saved and go to heaven. So the group of pagans and the Gentiles. Now, as with all of our classes, we have a list of resources. So if you want more information about any one of these groups, there's been a lot put into this class. Feel free to look at any of these resources, and there are hundreds more that you can find researching on the internet. Hope this has been helpful to you about the important people groups in the time of Jesus. See you next time.